Well, let's bring in now Behnam Ben Taleblu, who is a senior fellow at the Federation for Defence of Democracies with a focus on Middle East security and political issues. Thank you so much for your time here on BBC News. I'm interested for your analysis on Qatar's efforts to broker this deal.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. We've seen a lot of countries, particularly from that part of the world, try to audition for the role of peacemaker, track to, or even some would say informal go-between between the Israelis and Hamas. And in general, Qatar itself has recently been in the spotlight when it comes to covert or underground, you could say, nuclear diplomacy and hostage diplomacy between the U.S. And Iran. So it makes no surprise. It's no surprise to me, of course, that Qatar is looking to do this. It's some kind of additional spotlight, but also one can't forget, of course, the Hamas headquarters being in Doha, in the Qatari capital, and more of this kind of consistent streak of balancing and bandwagoning we've seen from some GCC states, particularly Qatar, in the past decade and a half, as they try to distinguish a particular foreign policy pathway for themselves.
That's Hamas's political headquarters you referenced there in Doha. With regards to bringing the two sides together, how likely do you think Qatar will be successful?
Listen, I think there's great domestic pressure on the government in Israel currently, particularly from the families, but also parts of Israeli society, to bring back the 240, I believe, hostages. Obviously, as the lead just mentioned, it's not going to be everybody. If this deal, as is being reported, goes through, you've had a U.S. official say nothing is finalized until everything is finalized. I think that seems to be the way the facts are being reported and remain in this holding pattern. But then again, some could be cautiously optimistic that, Qatar, the Europeans, the Americans might be able to pull a rabbit out of a hat. But that would also leave the Israelis in quite a bit of a political and strategic pickle, given their stated operational aims vis-a-vis Hamas, and given the fact that any real lull in the fighting would give Hamas more breathing room, more time to rearm, and also hinder the on-the-ground military operation that Israel is currently conducting.
What do you think could be on the table to get this agreement through? I'm just thinking back to the time that Israel, for example, gave just over 1,000 prisoners in exchange for one Israeli soldier. There's reported to be around 240 people being held hostage by Hamas. We know that several have been released, and we know that several have certainly died. What could Israel have to do to get the release of just the women and children, for example?
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned this, because this is on the mind of everyone who's looked at different iterations of this conflict in the past. In my view, this is a commitment of how much Israel does value the safety and security of not just its persons in uniform, but also its civilians, as you mentioned, over 240. But this does tend to lead to lopsided trades, lopsided deals that actually can put Hamas terrorists and strategists back onto the political and military playing field. You don't just see this with Hamas. You see this, more generally. Countries that take hostages know that the other side values life more than them, and that's why it's instrumentally been a weapon in the hands of states like the Islamic Republic of Iran for as long as it's been around, which by no accident is a major patron of Hamas. In fact, the most outsized foreign patron of Hamas. So in this case, it's likely that the Qataris are indirectly going to be making the case for more of the jailed Palestinians, likely the terrorists and the strategists and the planners tied to Hamas, to be freed from Israeli prisons, which will again lead in a lopsided deal. In my view, if this goes through, that would be a bit of an own goal, but one, again, can't do away with the fact that families continue to grieve and are a genuine source of political and social pressure on the government in Jerusalem at the moment.
And just briefly, if it does go through, like you mentioned, do you see this as the start of further dialogue between the two sides?
I'm not exactly sure. Much would depend on, at that point in time, the role of external forces, external mediating forces that may want to extend a ceasefire if it goes through. The facts on the ground of Israeli forces who will be remaining in Gaza, what kind of force protection measures they would have to take on. That question is dependent on a lot of exogenous other variables. That would be too cloudy to presume that we would know which way they would swing in one direction or the other.
Joining us live from Washington, Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.